Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for this, our final event of HRAD at home. My name is Jane Grabina, and I'm a trustee of NIF in the UK and a long-standing supporter of the New Israel Fund. We are delighted to be welcoming tonight two of the world's leading historians, Sir Simon Schama and Professor David Myers. Sir Simon Schama needs no introduction from me. He is a world-renowned expert on Jewish history and the writer and presenter of more than 50 television documentaries for the BBC, PBS, and the History Channel. Professor David Myers is the global president of the New Israel Fund. He is also a professor of Jewish history at UCLA and the director of the UCLA Center for History and Policy. His books include Reinventing the Jewish Past and Jewish History, a very short introduction. In this exclusive interactive webinar, our guests will give the long view on the recent American election results, what they mean for civil society and for the US Jewish community, and the implications for a new global political landscape. They will be speaking until 7:40, at which time we will open it up for your questions. So do please put your questions into the Q&A box that you will see on your screens. As I mentioned, this event forms the final part of the gala HRAD at home. This has been a huge success, with over £550,000 raised, and many thanks to all of you for your ongoing support. We will open tonight with an overview from Sir Simon Schama. So Sir Simon, over to you.
I didn't know my views were going to be over, or an overview, really, Jane. I think I'm not going to have a shot at an overview right now, or a speech about the election. The one thing about the word over is it's nice to report pretty much that the election is over. Never say it is completely over, of course, actually, until the Electoral College is met, which will happen on December the 18th. But nonetheless, today, two further states have certified their vote in favor of Vice President Biden, Pennsylvania, very importantly, and Nevada as well. So to all intents and purposes, it is over. And as you'll probably know from reading the papers, finally, the so-called General Services Administrator had decided to make available the materials and the wherewithal, both in terms of information and finance, to the transition team. However, on a kind of muzzled-off celebratory note, although there may be, and why not, fervent Trump supporters out there, it's nice to note that I think, David, you'll correct me if this is not the case, but it looks likely that we'll have both a Jewish Secretary of State and a Jewish Secretary of the Treasury. Can you think of a time when that, in a presidency, that will actually come into the administration on January the 20th in the shape of Tony Blinken and Janet Yellen? Antony Blinken's particularly interesting, I think, in Jewish history, because I'm sure lots of people know that his stepfather was an extraordinary man, died 5 years ago, called Samuel Pizar, who was an escapee from Sachsenhausen. He survived Sachsenhausen as a teenager, and Auschwitz, was an escapee from Dachau and went on to create the Yad Vashem in France. Tony was educated in France, is bilingual. And all this leads me to kind of pose the first slightly provoking question to you, dear David. One can already hear the neo-Nazis going to press, actually, to remonstrate against the Jewish cabal. I'm not thinking in purely literal terms of it being seen already as some sort of protocols of the Elders Design conspiracy masquerading as the next American administration, but more the case that if you look at the administration, if you look at particularly the distinguished people I've mentioned, they are exactly part of the kind of bi-coastal, metropolitan, Ivy League elite in respect of their expertise, their long Washington experience, their refreshing regard and appreciation for knowledge, that populism is designed and engineered to attack and to make capital out of. And as I say, never mind about the neo-Nazis, I can already sort of see Steve Bannon writing the sequel, actually. So not that this should give us pause to do anything but celebrate, in my view, but it did strike me looking at this kind of starry list of, super intelligent, brilliant Jews. This is just what populism needs.
Exactly. Yes, I mean, I think we've had one of each: a secretary of state who was Jewish and a secretary of the treasury who's Jewish, but we have not had at the same time. So this is further attestation to the extraordinarily prominent place of Jews in American society. Just as an aside, I would not dismiss the importance of the neo-Nazis fabricating their conspiracy theories, because they have picked up the pace of their work manifoldly over the last 5 years or so. According to all statistical markers that we have, anti-Semitic action and deed have increased very significantly, largely from the neo-Nazi right and their fellow travelers, that large group known as white nationalists, for whom the Jewish question really stands at the center of their worldview. And I think what's so dangerous as we think about this moving forward is that white nationalism has more than occasionally allied itself with the more mainstream media-driven right in the United States, the world of Fox television. And it's that alliance that I think has been discomfiting, and that could serve to generate new fodder for the grist of the anti-Semitic mill moving forward. But as with everything, one falls back on the Pat Dickensian formula: the best of times, the worst of times. Indeed, rates of anti-Semitism are rising in the United States, and Jewish access to positions of power has never been as realized as at the present. It really sets in context sort of the great divide in the United States, which I think we want to call attention to, and then perhaps think of the place of Jews in it, which is to say, we have never witnessed a turnout like this in our lifetimes. In fact, there hasn't been a turnout in an American presidential election of this scale since, I think, 1908. And that, I think, reflects the huge stakes that Americans felt in this race. The good news from our perspective is that a majority of Americans believed in decency and kindness over meanness, in liberal democratic values over populism, in truth over falsehood, in boredom, I would say, over relentless drama. And that majority really ranged ethnically, racially, socioeconomically, and generationally significantly. That's really great news, especially for the bicoastal perspective. What is sobering is that a near majority almost reelected Donald Trump. And what is even more sobering is that 70% of those who identify themselves as Republicans believed that this was not a free and fair election, such that we remain caught in this vice of ideological and epistemological divide, how we see the world. There's such a vast chasm. And as we know, it is not the right-wing alliance of the sort of establishment right and the white nationalist right versus the Jews. These divides exist within our own Jewish community.
They do indeed. I mean, it is all, I'm glad you use the E word as an epistemological. It is all about the status of knowledge, really. I mean, what is extraordinary, though, and you just alluded to that, is the way in which really cult-like dependence on revelation and belief which can't be shaken by simply the presentation of evidence or facts, has made its way into something like Fox. In fact, Fox is now, the extraordinary phenomenon of the last couple of weeks. I don't know how many people in the United Kingdom know about Newsmax and OAN, One American Newswork, which were incredibly fringe, only had about 8% of the market, something like that, and have now had an enormous kind of surge in ratings because they're prepared to subscribe to the most unhinged conspiracy theories, like the one, for example, being peddled by the lawyer Sidney Powell, who was sort of cut loose even from the Giuliani team, which proposed that there was a company called Dominion in this view had engineered a software program designed to falsify election returns. In fact, actually, everything was got wrong. Dominion, and this was engineered in Venezuela at the behest of Hugo Chavez, who of course has been dead since 2013. Sort of think about these conspiracy theories, they don't get their own internal history correct. Dominion has never had anything whatsoever to do with Venezuela. It's both located in America and in Canada. They were thinking, in fact, of a completely different company called Smartmatic, actually, which actually sued the Venezuelan government for a dispute precisely about the effectiveness of their software, and which is a bitter competitor with Dominion. So the two organizations, but in the kind of feverish mindset of fabricating a kind of fantasy world, actually, none of this sort of evidence matters. And you just mentioned, David, very, incredibly relevant, that the same sort of divide between the status of knowledge, what might call in a slightly pretentiously professorial way, the fruitfulness of the Baconian, this is nothing to do with Kashrut and Treif, I mean, talking about Francis Bacon here, the Baconian project of inductive reasoning, that you believe what is true as a result of the gathering of empirical evidence, versus a kind of notion that the heart is always ultimately more truthful than the head, that instinct, that epiphany and revelation will yield a truth against which intellect, if not completely powerless, ultimately will not win. And this goes this is one bit of the long view I can oblige Jane with. This goes very deep into American history. It goes to the Great Awakening. What is extraordinary in retrospect to me, if one thinks back to a figure like Thomas Jefferson, is Jefferson is a deist. And Jefferson and his particular generation of founding fathers were extremely concerned, in a way, actually, to bring the kind of force of intellect to the legitimization of the American democratic experiment. But it's always, if you go all the way through from the kind of crazier cults of evangelical Protestantism in the 18th and 19th century, all the way through to evangelical Protestantism now, and the kind of crazed spectacle. Did you see that of, women speaking? There was one woman who was Trump's, a wonderfully, here one has to use air quotes, Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, who was summoning angels. Did you see that, David? Summoning angels from the 4 continents, including Africa, to smash and smite the purported Biden election. The problem for us, I think, even as we kind of chuckle, possibly at our, at our own peril, actually, at that kind of universe, the problem is, what do we do about it, really? It's fine, you and I talking together, or it's fine, us editorializing in the wise broadsheets, singing from the same page. But as you say, a very large percentage of Republicans do not believe, actually, they don't believe that Joe Biden is a legitimate president at all, or that he actually won the election. So what do we do about that?
I hope I can get to that in a minute. Because it's the question we're all asking ourselves. But I want to just make a couple of comments picking up on things you said. First, Fox Television, Fox News. Fox News, which was the chief purveyor of many of the falsehoods that you've just described, often we've seen in 2016 and 2020, or in those 2 instances, transforms itself into a responsible media actor when the vote counting begins. It's a kind of remarkable volte-face and a reflection of the divide between.
Isn't it, David? Sorry to interrupt. It's a different barony. As I've been sort of thinking about that, Fox News proper, as it were, those who are responsible for the gathering of news, constitute a kind of semi-autonomous barony. And the Fox opinionators like Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Lou Dobbs are on the other side. So, but as you say, when the news comes in, the news guys get, yeah.
They bring out the news guys from the dark closet where they've been hidden for 4 years. And these people know how to count votes, and they know how to make prognostications of how things are turning out. And so it's very significant that Fox News called early on Tuesday night, I believe, Arizona. Which prompted, I mean, in this surreal universe we inhabit, the White House, Donald Trump, to call Rupert Murdoch and ask him to demand of him that he reverse this call of Arizona. I mean, that's the world we have entered into. What's the significance of this? Fox, at least the polling team, belongs to those elements of the American democratic institutions that have been working. The media has been working since the election, and the court system has been working. And in fact, they have demonstrated that for all of the fragility, for all of the erosion of democratic institutions and principles over the Trump years, there are still standing institutions that can and do function. And I think we should really call attention to that. Now to address the question of where.
Were you surprised by? I mean, I think I wasn't a kind of mad Jeremiah really about everything collapsing and it go to competing slates of electors, but I have to say I was slightly more on the nervous side of what might actually happen if Michigan was for example not certified. We had the spectacle yesterday or 2 days, I think it was just yesterday, wasn't it, about a youngish Republican vice chairman of the Michigan Board of Canvassers saying, well, I've looked at the law, I've looked at what we are supposed to be able to do, and it's not within our powers to actually request an audit, and actually cited John Adams actually about America being, that is very heartening. That is very heartening. The judge who delivered the withering dismissal in Pennsylvania of Rudy Giuliani's case, the entirety of the Pennsylvania vote, is an arch conservative Republican. So that's very good news.
And therefore, I don't think we could have predicted. I had been pleasantly surprised. I should just recapture, perhaps for this audience, the sensibility, the frame of mind upon hearing the news of the call of the election in favor of Joe Biden. So first, it was relief that this ordeal was over, the ordeal of the counting of votes, and then of the Trump era, and then joy and celebration. And you all saw the pictures of those folks taking to the streets to dance, and many of us felt that a kind of transition from Baruch Shebtarani, thank you, Lord, for liberating us from this burden, to Shehachianu, thank you for allowing us to arrive at this day. So that's sort of the emotional journey that we have followed, and I have to say I wasn't sure that Fox would continue its election day tradition, and I surely wasn't sure that the American judiciary, with all of the Trump appointees at the federal level, would stand as it did. You're absolutely right. That judge in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, a good upstanding member of the Federalist Society, which has been a feeder of all of these judges whom Trump has appointed to the federal judiciary, issued an unequivocal statement. This is absolute nonsense. And here I just have to add a point of personal pride. I am a native of Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is Joe Biden's hometown. My father is a very distinguished lawyer in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and it is his law firm that is representing both the governor and the secretary of state and has been fending off dozens of lawsuits at many different levels of jurisdiction, at the state level, at various federal levels, up to the Supreme Court, and they've won every single one, which bespeaks both their legal talents and the absurdity of the legal arguments that have been advanced. I want to say just a word about what can we do, but first I think we have to diagnose a little bit about where we are. So what creates that worldview between the coasts that seems so dissonant with the views of the majority in this election. I think it's a mix of toxic distortion.
That was my fault for saying the coast, because actually what actually made the difference were Wisconsin, Michigan,
Absolutely.
Minnesota.
Absolutely. Middle America. Middle America.
Very large chunk of the Midwest actually came
Middle
home.
America.
Yeah.
Right. It is a truism of American presidential politics that he or she who wins Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania wins the election. And there are some complications to that thesis, but it's indeed held true in the last two elections. So I think what we're witnessing is a mix of toxic distortion, very effective propaganda, propagated by the likes of Fox and those to the right of Fox, whom you mentioned, and something that I think you were gesturing towards, which is a new religious discourse that we see in the United States. And we could identify it as a discourse that sort of operates at the level of base popular religion, but I think that would be a mistake. It really operates at the highest reaches of American government. Mike Pompeo, Bill Barr, really hold to a view, I think really in the depths of their hearts, that secular law is and should be supported to God's law, to divine law. And Mike Pence, as well.
Yeah.
And Mike Pence as well. Yeah. So I think it would be a mistake to reduce the current moment to a kind of irrational base superstition. There's a coherent theological worldview that has taken hold in the upper reaches of the United States government under Donald Trump, who of course couldn't care less about that theological worldview, but is more than willing for pragmatic political reasons to support and embrace it. It's part of the reason that we have seen the growing prevalence of the discourse of religious liberties in American society and law today, drawing very much on the discourse of civil liberties from the 1960s, but really transforming it into something that's suited to the political moment and to the Christian evangelical base. Religious liberty can mean I have the right to assemble for the purposes of prayer in any condition that I choose, even in the midst of a global pandemic. That right, that liberty trumps all others. And I think we see that discourse blends with deeply entrenched American libertarianism to give real force to that 47%. I haven't answered your question. I've given you enough time to think about how you can answer how you can address the problem.
No, we neither of us have, and I'm not sure I do have a particular. I'm not sure I do have a particular recipe for the way this is supposed to be bridged. But so to avoiding that very sticky question, I just want to add that it's really amounts to a kind of hijacking of some of the original rhetoric around the generation, again, of the American Revolution, Jefferson's draft for the Statute of Religious Toleration in Virginia, which is all about the separation. Jefferson, we remember, proudly owned the Quran, the very Quran on which the first Muslim representative in congressman in the House of Representatives swore the oath on. But that kind of rhetoric actually about freedom was devoted in several debates against, it produced the First Amendment, that Congress should not pass any legislation in respect of the establishing religion. And as you say, it's extraordinary actually how it's elided in a way, it's mutated into a defense, for example, of those who hold certain religious principles being entitled not to serve gay customers, and not to accommodate gay customers in a hotel. I guess the crunch will come with whether we'll see Amy Coney Barrett, as the evangelical community, as it would devoutly, without trying to pun, hopes, actually acts on this kind of on this kind of move of fundamentalist devotional principles into institutions and into judgments, or whether or not she remains a much more independent justice. So I don't know.
Well, that's a really important and interesting question. I want to maybe just shift our focus for a minute to ask how this plays out within the Jewish community, which we started to hint at a minute ago, because many of these discourses and divides that we've just been talking about are present within the Jewish community. It would be a mistake, as we know well, in any setting, to characterize the Jews as a unified whole. What we know is the following. Somewhere between 70 to 77% of Jews in America voted for Joe Biden. We have two very divergent set of exit polls. My own sense is that the truth lies on the upper end, somewhere between, let's say, 72 and 75% voted for Joe Biden, which is more than the number of Jews who voted for Hillary Clinton. We had a very large and vocal minority of pro-Trump Jewish voters, especially notable in the Orthodox and even more prominently the Haredi community. What is really interesting to note is the quite dramatic shift in political behavior and attitudes in the Haredi community over the last 4 years. I've been studying one of these communities for about 15 years, Kiryas Yoel, New York, which is a community comprised entirely of Satmar Hasidim, about 25,000. It's a legally recognized municipality. And now, because it became a town, we're able to analyze election results a lot easier than before. What we know is, we don't yet have the final data from Kiryas Yoel. I've heard anecdotally that there was an unbelievably strong pro-Trump turnout in another Haredi community that is a legally recognized municipality called New Square. First reports say over 99% of the community voted for Donald Trump. This is a community that voted almost unanimously, -2 votes, for Hillary Clinton when she ran for the United States Senate in New York. So we have seen a really remarkable shift in the Haredi community, and more generally, though not at the same rates, in the Orthodox community, including the modern Orthodox community. And what I find so striking is the abandonment of the traditional position of a kind of non-ideological pragmatism that says we will vote for the person who brings us the greatest benefit to our community, without regard to political affiliation. That erstwhile position of pragmatism has yielded to a fiercely ideological, American-style, don't tread on me libertarianism, and bespeaks, paradoxically, I think, reflects the integration, the assimilation, the powerful forces of assimilation that affect even the most insular of communities in the United States. We know that.
I think some of that has to do with the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, which we should say that Joe Biden has already made clear will not be reversed. But or is that just that was
no? Because Haredi communities tend to be at best non-Zionist and very often anti-Zionist. So Israel is not the question for them. It is the question for the larger, the single question above all others for other parts of the Orthodox world, but not so much for the Haredi world. It is really a sense of security, of law and order, of stability, a kind of classic Jewish conservative sensibility, which we know of through Jewish history. Jews tended to ally themselves with state power, including and especially conservative sovereigns who were not particularly interested in upending the established order. So I think there's a kind of deep structure that is reemerging within the Haredi community that taps into what my revered teacher and your dear friend and colleague Yosef Yerushalmi called the Royal Alliance of the Jews. I think we see a new iteration of that Royal Alliance in the Haredi community, as well as a new ideological commitment to a kind of libertarian sensibility.
This particular sovereign, King Don, has a soft spot for Nazis. That seems not to matter, really. I mean, one can certainly see that in respect of Donald Trump refusing to take social distancing, other public health, mitigating mask wearing and so on seriously, that might have appealed immediately, because it was thought somehow that the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, and the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, were coming down hard on the Haredi, indeed the larger ultra-Orthodox community, for not respecting, for example, the ban on inside gatherings, because the second surge came at the time of the Yom Noraim, at the time of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And in fact, I think actually one of the instructions about the return of more restrictive conditions was announced by Mario Cuomo, if I'm right in saying, on the second day of Sukkot, actually. And this was actually a classic instance designed to be an anti-Semitic gesture. Why not Black Lives Matter protesters? The answer to which is they're all outside, actually. But one can see actually how that fed in, that masking became. But again, the pictures actually show a non-monolithic ultra-Orthodox community. You're quite right to say that. So very hard to tell. I haven't specifically seen pictures coming from Kiryas Joel and from New Square, but there's been a lot more masking. But the problem was there was a particular wedding of was it a Satmar wedding? In fact, of a grandson. Was it Teitelbaum's grandson? Something, yeah.
Grandson of Rabbi Teitelbaum.
Thousands of Haredi assembled, really, and positivity rates in Kiryas Joel were 28%. And this was, I think, just before Rosh Hashanah. So it was.
Yeah, and interesting to note that in opposing Governor Andrew Cuomo, with whom the two factions of the Satmar world had a very warm relationship, as they did with his father, the former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo. They wrap themselves in the rhetoric of religious liberty. And what we see is, in a certain sense, not just the Americanization of Haredim, but the Christianization of Haredim, because they really have adopted the language of the very powerful Christian evangelical right, whose representatives are now well positioned in the halls of power in Washington. I find that just an incredibly fascinating, but not surprising phenomenon, and a very sort of American phenomenon, the privileged place of religion, and particularly illiberal forms of religion, notwithstanding the Jeffersonian wall of separation and the commitment to opposition to the establishment of religion that Jefferson represented. We remember that there were some states that actually established religion in the first days of the American Republic. And that is a tradition that also has deep roots in the United States. Enclave societies committed to separatism and decidedly illiberal forms of communal organization have not just survived, they have thrived in the United States. That too is America. And it's important to understand that. And it's important to understand its 21st century garb, which is the language of religious liberty. And now Christian and Jewish advocates are joining forces to prosecute the case of religious liberty today. And I speak as an observant Jew for whom religious ritual observance is extremely important. But something has gone awry for which there's not an evident cure.
It should be said again for our viewers that the demographics of this, I suppose you might say, are assuring. The Pew Educational Trust commissioned a demographic survey of the Jewish community in 2015, and their figures, whether they're correct or not, showed that the Orthodox percentage of the total Jewish community of between 5 and 6 million were no more than 10%, actually. And the Haredi proportion of that, you're the scholar of that, would be even smaller. So I'm not saying that, because actually it's also the case that I think 30%, a huge percentage of that overall figure, consisted of Jews who professed to have no denomination within Judaism. The second largest were Reform Jews, the third largest conservative movement, which I belong. But the Orthodox constitute, of course, they pull more than their their purely numerical weight, as we've both just been talking about, but it is still a far smaller percentage. What is it in Israel? It's 15%, David? It's a bit more than that now? Between 15 and 20%. It's growing.
20,
Yeah. So I guess actually the only other
I
point...
mean, religious Zionist and Haredi together, I think, is about 20.
Yes. So I think before we sign off and make way for questions, the one thing I did want to pick your brains about, really, and we've left this almost impossible question about how does one side of America try and persuade the other. Sometimes one thinks that simply the fact of the matter, including the rather urgent facts of the matter resulting from pandemic, will do the work for you. But of course, not necessarily. And a debate has grown up inside the Jewish community, as it has in Israel as well, about the place of non-Torah learning, of secular learning in yeshivot and Jewish schools. And there is, I think he's called Naftali Moster, is that right? Actually, a young man who grew up as a Haredi and realized as he grew up, he'd had absolutely all he'd had, even in elementary or middle school, was a smattering. You get 1 hour a day of maths and English, a very small amount indeed. And then you have none. High school is in fact a kind of mini yeshiva, isn't it? So it's just actually Torah and Talmud studies and nothing else at all. And this means that somewhere like Kiryas Yoel and New Square and so on, as with Bnei Brak and places like that in Israel, are extremely poor and very, very poorly equipped actually to make their way in a modern world, as well as have receptive antennae to the needs of something like a pandemic when it happens, being able to listen to the science. Then I read as well, this is, then I'll shut up, that the one interesting variant on this is Haredi women or ultra-Orthodox women, who, because they're not allowed actually to study, have actually been able to access much more secular learning than their male counterparts. And I know for a fact that actually it's not true that the ultra-Orthodox community and even the Haredi community never go anywhere near computers. There have been very interesting stories lately that during the pandemic, business has flourished through Amazon precisely because you don't have to be in the same room as the Goyim or Jews who are not super Orthodox as well. So there are ways perhaps in which the modern world will crack the carapace of this insulation from secular learning.
I couldn't agree more. It is a mistake to think that that world, or any world for that matter, is frozen in time and somehow not immune to the forces of history. We know that the one ironclad rule in history is the constancy of change. And I think it's really important to emphasize anew, Haredi individuals and subcommunities are subject to the same forces of acculturation and assimilation as anyone else. We see that, as I've just argued, in the newly developed political ideology of Haredim in America, which really is almost indistinguishable from that of Christian evangelicals. It's a mixture of libertarianism and this discourse of religious liberty. You're also right on to point to the role of women. Although very few Satmar Haredim that I know about would embrace the doctrine of feminism, there are shifts within the Haredi world driven principally by women. I mean, it's no surprise that most positive change in human society comes from women. And indeed, that's the case here. It's not born necessarily of an insatiable intellectual curiosity as much as it is by the need to sustain a household, by basic economic necessity. Women have said, this business model isn't working, right? You can't have 10 or 12 kids and an under or unemployed husband and somehow sustain yourself. And that has prompted women to begin to equip themselves to enter the workplace. One of the ways they've done so is by acquiring skills in technology. And we know in Israel, this is a phenomenon that's very present in Israel. We know of technological colleges that are built almost exclusively for Haredi women. who don't have to worry about concerns of modesty or interaction with men other than their husbands or family members. And here, I think there are real signs of positive change being driven by women who are entering the marketplace, the workplace, and receiving levels of education that they did not have previously. And not surprisingly, we're also seeing that birth rates are beginning to decline in some of those communities, as a number of scholars have charted. So I guess for me, the main takeaway of the Biden election is similar to the principle that I've just articulated, which is the constancy of change. Many of us felt that we were falling deeper into the abyss of Trumpism, and it turned out that change was possible. We see the first glimmers of a return to normalcy, to use that neologism of presidential candidate Warren G. Harding in the 1920 election, which Joe Biden used again. We see the return to the adherence to the rule of law. We see a return to the principle of bilateralism, diplomacy, internationalism. And we haven't had a chance to talk about it, but we see a return to concern with a fair-minded solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I just read before I came on an article in Haaretz about new contacts between the Palestinian Authority and the Biden team. So we're reminded of the invigorating effects of change, and we hope that it will be a new and better day.
Thank you, David. And I think on that, Simon, I think on that very optimistic note, the questions are flowing in, and please do keep them coming, and I'll try and group them and get through as many as possible. And I think sticking with Israel, which is where David took us, we have a question from Jonathan Boyd, who many of you, I'm sure, know as the great Jonathan Boyd, one of the key demographers of our community, who asks, to what extent do you think Trump and his administration are to be praised for the Abraham Accords?
Is this for me?
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't. I thought I would just echo the muted assent of Joe Biden. It'd be really perverse, I think, actually, if to say actually because this was something engineered by Jared Kushner or Mike Pompeo or whatever, for that very reason, it's to be deplored. Of course, it's not to be deplored. So it is a genuinely historic opening, and it's got to be welcomed. It should be said, of course, the fly in the ointment, as it were, is the hideous autocratic nature of most of those regimes, certainly of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia as well. It's part of the Faustian deal made between the Trump administration and the Saudis in particular with MBS was partly to do with the delivery of heavy weapons, which were then used lavishly in the kind of horrific war in Yemen, and also turning a blind eye to the appalling slaughter of Khashoggi as well, things like that. So these were of no concern. So there was a kind of harmony of thuggism, really. And what we are going back to, as well as multilateralism, is a commendable concern not to simply hold your nose at the most egregious violations of human rights. At least, with one certainly hopes that will be the case. So, but the answer is, how much credit do you give? We don't know yet, but some I'm quite sure, and it would be churlish to deny that. I think. Yeah. David may have a harsher view.
Oh, I'll just chime in agreement. I think we should give credit where credit is due. I think that's a real diplomatic achievement. I think a number of the other things for which Trump has been praised with respect to Israel, I think have not necessarily been in Israel's best interest, but I think this clearly is, as I see it, and principally for, I guess I would say, collective psychological reasons. I believe that normalization by the Arab world is soothing to the Israeli psyche, which in many respects is still suffering from the depths of trauma of the Holocaust. And I think in the first instance, it is a deflection from the core issue, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think if we dig a little bit deeper, it is important, indeed necessary, to lay the conditions for Israel to be able to understand its enemy as its partner in peace. And the same exists for the Palestinians. They too require assurance, comfort, soothing for the deep trauma at the core of their national identity, which is the Nakba. I think we're really destined to see a perpetual clash until we can understand, until we can mitigate that trauma, until we can expose the wounds to the light of day and have them heal. And I think normalization really advances that cause. And so I think at the end of the day, we're actually just at the beginning of the day, at this point in time, this is a good thing.
I would expect the Biden administration actually to restore funding to the Palestinian Authority, which was cut off by Trump, actually, don't you think? And so again, there's already been a re-establishment of security arrangements between the authority and the Israeli government. So you just have to kind of, oil the gears and gear levers and all that, actually, and let it happen.
Yeah.
And then of course, one of the
one thing we've not spoken about, sorry, Adam, just I would suspect, the opening to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain was conditional on Bibi Netanyahu not going ahead with annexation, and I would certainly expect the Biden administration actually to take a pretty fierce line on that.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's amongst the restoration of normalcy that we can expect. The Jerusalem embassy transfer is a fait accompli, but the green light given to settlement expansion and even the prospect of annexation by some in the Trump administration, I think that belongs now to the past. The new team coming in, I think, will be much harsher on Netanyahu, and therefore I think we, in thinking of the question, is Trump good for the Jews? I think Trump has been very good for Netanyahu. Has he been good for the Jews? Dubious. Has he been good for Israel? I think he's been good for the personal and political interests of the prime minister. Now I think we're going to see a president who will be good for Israel in the most holistic sense.
And that takes us very neatly to a question from Paul Berger, who happens to be one of the NIF board members, who is asking about how we think Prime Minister Netanyahu will respond to Biden, considering this major shift in leadership and the close relationship and association that Netanyahu had with Trump. Will he return, as Paul described it, to playing the rebellious son as he did with Obama? How do we think Netanyahu will respond to the Biden administration?
Well, I'll just say a very quick word about that before leaving it to David, is that one forgets that Netanyahu and Biden go back a long way as well. One always forgets that Netanyahu had is almost as much of an American as he is actually. He spent all that time at MIT and in Massachusetts. He has one great thing about Anshel Pfeffer's brilliant biography, in my view, is that he showed how deeply Netanyahu assimilated very profound aspects of American culture, and he knows Joe Biden as well. It's not, so I would expect that he won't be as thrilled as he would have been by the re-election of Donald Trump. But actually, I think the idea that he will actually pay no attention to, or he will, especially with Tony Blinken, who he must know as well. I would be very surprised if Netanyahu was out actually to put relations in a deep freeze. I mean, why would you want to do that? But
yeah. I mean, he tried to draw his lines in the sand. I think on Sunday he gave a speech at a Ben Gurion memorial, warning about making about the United States beginning anew negotiations over an Iran nuclear deal. So he fired his warning shots over the bow. But you're absolutely right, Sir Simon. He knows Joe Biden very well. He considered him a friend, and Joe Biden considered him a friend until Joe Biden arrived one day as vice president. And on that very day, Bibi Netanyahu announced an expansion of settlements in East Jerusalem, which was, as things go, a pretty reasonably sized diplomatic slap in the face. But they know each other well. If one were to imagine a spectrum of likability from Bibi Netanyahu's perspective, with Donald Trump on one end and Barack Obama on the other end, Joe Biden is somewhere in the middle, and maybe even a little closer to Trump. What we've heard out of sort of the Netanyahu world so far about Tony Blinken has been very positive. Dory Gold, who ran the foreign ministry, was director general of the ministry, knows and likes and considered Tony Blinken a reasonable person, as have people on the other side of the political spectrum. So I think there must be some sense of relief as well. Even in Israel, where support for Trump was so astronomically high, that there is a restoration of normal diplomatic behavior and behavior and rhetoric. It must have been very difficult to stay abreast of Trump's latest tweets and tantrums, and so initial period will be one of good behavior on all parts. I think the Biden administration is likely to adopt a perspective that is far more supportive of the Palestinian right to self-determination. And by that time, it will be interesting to see if Bibi Netanyahu is still around. He is a cat with 9 lives, and his trial was postponed yet again from January now to February. But at some point, the Netanyahu era will come to an end. The long Netanyahu decade, as I think of it, that began in 2009, it will come to an end. And I think, in a certain sense, the more important question is to think what will be the day after Netanyahu, which I would imagine will occur on Joe Biden's watch.
Running this back to the U.S. Jewish community and Jewish community relations, we have a question from Rabbi Daniela Kolodny, who's asked if you could speak about U.S. Jews' commitment to Israel after the election, perhaps distinguishing between generations as well as religious affiliations.
Sure. There have been very sharply defined generational divides that have come to the fore within the community, within the Jewish community in the United States in recent years. I guess I would phrase it this way. I belong, maybe am one of the last members of a long generation that operated in the shadow of the Holocaust, for whom the core existential question was, how will the Jews survive? And in phrasing that question, Israel plays a major role in guaranteeing the survival of the Jewish people. That is not the question that my daughter's generation asks. They don't operate in the shadow of the Holocaust. They don't operate with that constant existential threat. They ask themselves, why should I be connected to that bully? That's the question that many in a younger generation of American Jews pose. And so we have a really serious challenge in connecting that generation, which is the future of our community, to an Israel of which they can be proud. I think we have a much better crack at it now that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, whose election is extraordinarily important and historic in the ways that are obvious to us.
With a Jewish husband.
With a Jewish, whose stepkids call her Mamala, it should be noted. I think that's the great challenge, and I think Biden gives us a better crack at it. It's not the panacea. The election of Joe Biden is not going to solve these very core generational differences that have surfaced. But I also want to state that, for the record, that it's not only the case that younger generations are pulling away. In some cases, they have found new portals of activism, sometimes very sharp-edged forms of activism, like the organization If Not Now, which took rise in the wake of the 2014 Gaza war, and began its activity by reciting Kaddish for all those killed in the Gaza war, Palestinian and Israeli. It's important to note that those kids have not disengaged. They've engaged on their terms. And I think one of the great challenges is going to be to find that younger generation, our students on campuses from Columbia to UCLA, find them on their terms. There's a very palpable sense amongst that generation that the image of Israel that we sold them in a variety of educational settings, schools, day schools, camps, informal education, was a completely tinny, one-dimensional view of Israel. And it didn't really have credibility. They arrived on a college campus and they saw a poster that said Israel equals apartheid, and they had no idea what they were encountering. They knew nothing about the occupation. So I think we have to continue and with the project of altering and making more real the educational package that we deliver to our kids, but also learning to find them on the terms that are meaningful to them. Sometimes their interest is in LGBTQ matters and or environmental matters or immigrant rights. And there we can connect them to Israel and to Israelis who are interested in exactly the same things. So I think we need to undertake something broader than even the election of Joe Biden, which is an educational revolution in how we teach and talk about Israel.
I would just say, add to that, you'll know, I mean, quite apart from the New Israel Fund, there are kind of tiny but very brilliant points of light, which are places where Israelis work day by day in practical sense with Palestinians and indeed with Jordanians. One I'm very slightly involved with is called Eco-Peace, run by the wonderful Gideon Bromberg, which has offices in Tel Aviv and in Amman and Ramallah, and which is about actually, and it's an environmental organization which is concerned particularly with the appalling condition of the Jordan riparian system, and also about the exchange of energy from solar energy from Jordan, from desalinated water exported from Israel to Jordan. So that's there are also schools like Yad B'Yad, Hand in Hand, which have Palestinian and Israeli students, and indeed board of governors. And there are things, I think, which can be bigged up, David, actually, which are particularly attuned to some of the core interests that the kids have. You know, what's more compelling than an environmental organization that actually stretches beyond the narrow confines of Israeli autarky.
Yeah. Before the pandemic hit, we were on the verge of launching a new initiative for NIF US that would really focus on new ways of connecting our younger generations to younger Israelis, to really enhancing the people-to-people connections that we think are so important to building deep relationships. And the day will come soon when we will return to that activity, because it's absolutely essential to the well-being of NIF, the well-being of the American Jewish community, and I think the well-being of Israel as well.
Thank you. And I'm just very aware of the time, and whilst I'd be very happy to sit here for the rest of my evening, that's probably very unfair on both of you. And if I can indulge you for an extra 2 minutes, firstly to say a huge thank you to David and Simon for joining us, and it would not surprise anyone how erudite and fascinating they have been, but just to really sort of frame it around all these issues that we've all spent a lot of time worrying about, or in my case, following Simon on Twitter. He's been my main source of information on the US elections. And thank you. And thank you. But could I ask you both, and I say this with the deepest respect to you as historians, to put on your future-looking hat and maybe point to us each, if you may, one thing that we should be looking out for in the next, say, 3 to 6 months, which may really either be a point of light, as you've discussed, or a real key indicator of where we think the direction of one of these issues that you've raised, whether it's democracy or the relationship of Israel to the US, something that we should be looking for?
Well, we have a runoff in Georgia on January the 5th, actually. And I would kind of, including one of the candidates, John Ossoff, is certainly Jewish, but I would love to say that, and it will be a test, one of the extraordinary things that happened when Georgia turned blue was the result of the astonishing mobilization of voting energy and numbers by Stacey Abrams, who just barely failed in her election bid to become the governor of Georgia in the midterm election of 2018. She's now continuing that work. And the hope is, it's very, very important because it will determine the control of the Senate. And that in turn will determine the freedom of action that the Biden administration will have. I'm not enormously optimistic. I don't know. I'd be very interested in what David thinks, actually. But it will be a kind of litmus test of the dynamics of energized and mobilized vote against the clear phenomenon, which also happened in this election, which was a less happy thing for down ballot votes to come home to the Republican Party. So, but that's something everyone should keep their eyes open.
Yes, I would say the same. It was the first thing that came to my mind, the Georgia election. If the Democrats win 2 seats, there will be a split in the Senate, 50-50, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. Ties are broken by the vice president, so that would allow the Biden administration to work with both the Democratic Congress and Senate, which would greatly facilitate the passage of legislation. I'm not sure that we're going to see that. There may be one Democratic pickup there. Both races are extremely close. One is a well-known African-American pastor, Raphael Warnock. The other is a young Jewish businessman, John Ossoff, running against 2 incumbents. I think a good indicator of where things may go is the ability of the Biden administration quickly to pass a stimulus package that will get resources to the American people, individuals, families, and businesses. That will be an indication of whether they are going to be able to work with the United States Senate in whatever configuration it may have. I think 2 key measures of Biden's success will be his ability to work with Mitch McConnell, the current Senate Majority Leader, who is in a certain sense a classic institutionalist, but has cast his lot in with the other group that I think has been so prominent over the last 4 years, the disruptors. So I divide the world into institutionalists and disruptors, and McConnell has sort of swayed between the two. Can Biden bring him back into the camp of the institutionalists? And I think that will be an important measure of the ability to actually make progress. I think another really important question, and here I have more confidence, is Biden's ability to make for a peaceable House within the Democratic Party. It seems unimaginable that the centrist faction and those represented by the Squad, those on the Bernie Sanders left side of the spectrum, can actually inhabit that House peaceably. I have a measure of confidence given what we've seen in the election itself and some things that we've heard subsequently, including from Bernie Sanders' campaign manager, that Biden will be able to hold the House in order. And if so, I think the Democratic Party will be able to affect some positive change in American society over the next 4 years.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you again to Simon and David for giving up their time so generously to be with us. For the New Israel Fund, this is the end of our Human Rights Awards Dinner at Home season, and thank you for those who joined us for the main event earlier this month in our Cook Along with Honey and Co. We really appreciate having such a community with us online. And just to say that we plan from Mechanica onwards to be putting on a whole range of hopefully very interesting and challenging digital events, and we look forward to sharing the details of this with you. And may I wish you an evening, and thank you particularly to those who are going to now watch the Great British Bake Off Final on iPlayer and decided to join us instead. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you.